But I'm Lindsey. I'm the soybean and small grain agronomist at Ohio State, and I've been here about 10 years, which is great. I'm going to talk about some of our soybean trials we've had over the past couple of years. I guess before I jump into that, there's more announcements that I have. In terms of seeding rate, I'll talk a little bit about that. I think I talked about that last year. We have a new virtual self-paced course focused on soybean and corn seeding rates. This is free from the USDA grant. So if you're interested in that, you have to register. There's a QR code for that as well. So I've talked to this group quite a bit. I think JD raised a hand. I don't know, JD, if you can talk. Okay, there you go, JD. All right. So the number one factor that influences soybean yield. I know I've talked about this quite a few in counties and on webinars before, and it's hard because it's a webinar, but the number one management factor that influences soybean yield is planting date. So this is some data we've had collected several years ago, and it was based on a paper survey, and some of you may have taken the survey. But basically, we asked we asked farmers what their soybeans yields were, and then correlated or looked at corresponding management practices that influence their yield. And across this survey, the one factor that popped up the most as important was planting date. So the bottom of this graph here shows days after April 1st, and then producer reported soybean yield. Northern Ohio is this first box A, and Central and Southern Ohio is B. But what you see here is this line and the slope of this line. So basically for Northern Ohio, for each day soybeans were planted after the end of April, there was a half bushel per acre reduction in yield. So that's quite a bit. In Central Ohio, it wasn't quite as much. It was 0.15 bushel per acre per day, but still a significant reduction. There's one state in this study where there was no response to planting date, and that was North Dakota. In the years of this study, which I believe were 2014, 2015, it was very dry, and planting date didn't matter when it was dry. This is some of the water balance information. So each one of these dots is a region. Again, Ohio is region 1, so this is where there's a half bushel per acre per day reduction in soybean yield. So there was more water available. So planting date was really important. Region 3, again, as a reminder, down at the bottom, this was North Dakota area. Water was extremely limiting, and there was no yield response to planting date. And so planting date is the number one factor that influences soybean yield, but when you run out of water, it's less important. And I think some growers have seen that in Ohio as well. This is some data from our small plot research. The first two lines here are from Clark County. This is the Western Agricultural Research Station. But basically, when we plant either beginning of May or mid-May, the slope's about the same. It's a 0.6 bushel per acre per day loss in soybean yield for each day soybean planting is delayed. The bottom line here, this is Northwest Ohio. It's a flat line. So that year was droughty, and planting date didn't really matter. We could plant in early May into June, and no effect on yield. So really the question that kind of piqued my interest with this planting date research was, how early is too early? I see a lot on social media and newspapers about farmers planting really early. So this is something that I was interested in. So we did a study in 2021 to look at this a little bit closer. This was an article my husband and I wrote for the Corn newsletter in April of 2021. Planting in early April, is that a good idea or a bad idea? And that's a really hard judgment call because you don't know what the rest of the year is going to look like. But this was published in April 2013. So looking back at the first week of April in 2021, this past year, was pretty good. These are average 2-inch soil temperature that first week of April. In Clark County, which is West Central Ohio, and Pike County, which is Southern Ohio, soil temperatures on average, we're about 50 degrees, which is what the temperature we'd like to see for planting, and 48 degrees in more northern parts of the state. What's tricky though is you don't know when that last freeze date will occur. In 2020, we had that Mother's Day freeze, and so in about May 12th or so, May 13th, we did have freezing temperatures and a light dusting of snow in some areas. 2019 though, the last freeze date was April 16th in southern Ohio and April 2nd for more central or northern areas. And you know, if you delayed planting in 2019, it might have been delayed to June or never because of the wet weather we had. So these decisions can be very tricky to make. So no one laughs at this slide when I do it in person. So this is a webinar, so someone is still not laughing. So that's fine. But really, when you're looking at planting dates, there's always a balance between reward and risk, right? So the reward is, you know, if you have adequate water at pod setting, you'll have a higher yield. So that plant can really maximize that longer growing season to have a high yield. The risk though, you know, there's imbibitional chilling, and then freeze damage can damage soybean plants. So imbibitional chilling is when you plant your seed, and it could be corn or soybean, you plant your seed, and that first drink that the seed takes up when it imbibes with water is cold. So if that water is less than 50 degrees, it's referred to as imbibitional chilling, and it can damage the soybean seed or corn seed. Freeze damage, this is something we see in Ohio too sometimes. Basically for soybean, the growing point is between the cotyledons. And so if the plant dies below the cotyledons, like you see here, the plant will die. In 2021, last year, in a lot of areas, I just saw bronzing on the cotyledons themselves, on the edges, or maybe on the leaves. That won't kill the plant and may look ugly, but damage has to be at that growing point or below to kill. And for soybean, the soybean plant's most susceptible to freeze damage when that cotyledon is just coming out of the ground. So when that, I guess the hypocotyl, when the hypocotyl is just coming out of the ground, that's when it's most sensitive to those cold temperatures. So in 2021, we had a planting date and a cover crop study. And so we really wanted to look at those early planting dates that we haven't done before in our research. So I called that my ultra early planting date. That was the first week of April is what we were targeting there. Early, we were targeting the last week of April, and then normal was mid-May. And then we also had cover crop treatments. So we looked at none. So non-treated control. We looked at rye that was killed early. So we planted it into a dead cover crop. So that's this middle picture here. This was all terminated with herbicide. And then we had a plant green or rye terminated late treatment, which is this last picture. So basically we planted soybeans and then killed the cover crop with herbicide within 1 week of planting. So you planted into a green standing cover crop. And really the reason we were doing this is because a farmer had some observations that he had a cover crop with a lot of residue in 2019, and he got that freeze, or maybe it was 2020, he got a freeze, and then his soybean stand didn't look that bad. So his hypothesis was that the cover crop helped protect against freezing temperatures. So we kind of wanted to test that hypothesis. So this study we had at 2 locations in Worcester, so the northeastern part of the state, where it can be a little bit cooler, and then also in Clark County in west central Ohio. So 2 very different growing environments. These are our dates. So our cover crop was planted in fall of 2020 in mid-October. And then our planting dates were pretty similar or the same between those 2 locations, which doesn't usually happen. But our ultra early was April 6th in Worcester, April 5th in South Charleston. Early was April 28th at both locations. And then normal was either May 26th or May 27th. Our normal planting date was a little bit later than what we wanted, but the weather prevented us from planting in mid-May like we wanted to. So these are some pictures of the soybean plants on May 13th from Worcester. So this is that more northern environment. These soybeans were planted on April 6th, so it's been over a month, and they were very much still coming out of the ground, very early stages. We had some soybean plants that were just clipped off at the stem. This could have been freeze damage. I have suspicions there could have been slugs as well. I'm not completely sure. You can see that the cotyledons, I think there was some bean leaf beetle damage on the cotyledons, freeze damage. This soybean plant, the cotyledon is just stuck in the soil. So it was hard for those plants to come out of the ground. So it's a pretty ugly field in May. But these are our Worcester stand counts. So we did stand counts in June, so we wanted to wait for all 3 planting dates to be up, all the soybeans to be up. So with stand in Worcester, there was an interaction between planting date and the presence of a cover crop. So you see both of that on the graph here. So across the bottom, we're looking at ultra early, which is first week of April, early, which was end of April, and then normal planting dates, which were the end of May this year. And then the different colors represent no cover in light green, early terminated cover crop in just green, and I guess dark green would be our plant green treatment. So we planted into that standing cover crop. Ideally, what we like to be for soybeans is in this red circle. So, you know, if we plant soybeans, we want to see a stand hopefully of 100 to 120,000 plants per acre. And then this black line is our replant threshold. So we don't recommend farmers replant their soybeans until they get to 50,000 plants per acre or less. And I guess it's important to mention our seeding rate here. So our seeding rate was 120,000 seeds per acre, which is on the lower side of what would be normal or agronomically optimum, just because we wanted to test this system and see if the cover crop helped protect stand at all. But what you see here, anything with A is statistically the same. So our stand was greatest when we had no cover crop and planted early, and also had no cover crop and planted end of May, or that normal timing. When we planted ultra early, that first week of April, we had stands close to 20,000 plants per acre when we had a cover crop either terminated early or terminated late. It didn't matter. When we planted the end of April, stand was the same regardless of cover crop, so that didn't matter. And it was right around that 50,000 plant per acre threshold. And then for a normal planting date, when we had a cover crop, our stand was reduced as well. My hypothesis with that ultra early in these low stands, the soils were cooler and wetter. And we have some of those measurements. And then also, I think there was maybe perhaps some slugs there in those areas where there was cover crops. For the normal planting date, when we had a cover crop, I think the reduced stand could have been attributed to just, it's challenging to plant when your cover crop is that tall. So just some planting issues with that large amount of cover crop biomass, perhaps. Moving to South Charleston, so this is our west central location. There was no significant interaction between planting date and cover crop, so I'm showing each of those factors separately. So when you're looking at just planting date alone, this first graph, everything was above that 50,000 threshold, but we did see the highest stand or greatest number of plants per acre for that normal planting date, which is end of May. And then in terms of cover crops, which is our next slide over, in terms of cover crops, our stand was greatest with no cover, but the same for that plant green treatment, and a little bit lower from early termination compared to no cover crop. So less dramatic impact on stand in our Western Ohio location versus Northern environment. And looking at the plots or the plants there in South Charleston, there was some freeze damage, but it was mostly isolated just to maybe some bronzing on the cotyledons. So these are some pictures of South Charleston, so Clark County in early July. Across the top, these are plots with no cover, early terminated, and then planted green. And then for our ultra early planting date across the top, and then normal planting date. So you can see with our normal planting dates is end of May, how much cover crop biomass really there was in those plots. And you can see, you know, for ultra early planting, there are quite a few gaps, maybe where our stand was not quite as filled in. But what's really interesting is, you know, just a few months later in September, these are the exact same plots, July to September, that the plots almost look exactly the same. So even though stand was reduced with that early planting, those soybean plants really filled in quite nicely. So really where the rubber hits the road is when we're looking at yield. So in terms of yield, this is going back now to Northern Ohio. Yields were really high in 2021. Everything I circled is statistically the same year. I guess anything with an A is statistically the same yield. When we're looking at no cover, regardless of planting date, our yields were around 70 bushels per acre. When we look at our early planting date, so this was the end of April, statistically, all the yields are the same there as well, regardless of stand or regardless of cover crop treatment. And then for our ultra early and then our normal planting date, we do see lower yields when there was a cover crop. And it seemed that yield was the lowest when we had those plant green compared to the early termination of the cover crop within those planting dates. And I've superimposed our stand counts here as a reminder. So again, with those ultra early, that first week of April planting date in Worcester, our stand was about 20,000 plants per acre, which is really low. This is something that we would tell farmers to replant. And certainly the yields here are a lot lower than 70 bushels per acre, but I thought it was particularly interesting that our stand was 20,000 plants per acre, and we got close to 55 bushels per acre. I would not have guessed, looking at that stand in May and June, that it would have, those plants would have branched out as much and produced as many pods to compensate for that low plant population. And the same here with our early planting date. This was, again, end of April. Our stands are right at that replant threshold, but our yields were about 70 bushels per acre. So that gives me more confidence in that 50,000 plant per acre replant threshold, especially when you plant early enough and the plant has more time to put on more branches to compensate for those poor stands. So in South Charleston, so moving to Clark County, this is looking at planting date only. There was no interaction of planting date and cover crop treatment. So in South Charleston, when we planted in April, either early April or end of April, our yields were the same. We did not see a significant reduction in yield until we went to that end of May planting date. So no additional benefit of the first week of April versus the last week of April. Stand again, so stand for those April planting dates was that 65 to 75,000 plants per acre, so not what we'd like to see necessarily, but in terms of yield, probably didn't make that big of a difference because those plants had time to branch out. Our normal planting date did have a higher stand. It was closer to 100,000 plants per acre, but our yield was reduced. And I think this just kind of shows too that planting date is really important. And stand, you want a good stand, but probably a little bit secondary compared to planting date. In terms of cover crop in South Charleston, there was no difference. So whether we had no cover crop, early terminated cover crop, or planted green, yields were exactly the same. So some key takeaways from this study, it's only 1 year of data. So really, we need these studies replicated in time, so multiple years and space, so multiple locations. And so we are going to repeat this study, the cover crops planted already, but we're going to repeat it this year in 2022. And also we have to keep in mind 2021 was an abnormally good year. So in a different year that was maybe more normal, or even, a poor year, our results could be different. So we'll see what happens next year. The effect of cover crops is variable. South Charleston, in terms of yield, didn't really matter whether there was a cover crop or not. In Worcester, cover crops did matter, but only for when we planted really early or the end of May. For that middle planting date, there was no effective cover crop at all on yield. And really what's amazing to me as an outcome of this study the most is how soybean plants can compensate for low populations. When I went out to these plots in August and saw the number of branches, it was a lot. So this is one of the pictures from Worcester. I think this plot had about 40 or 50,000 plants per acre. So you can see the amount of branching that's going on there. So good idea, bad idea, planting in April last year. In Wayne County, if it was the end of April, it didn't seem to matter. That ultra early, very first week of April was probably too early for Wayne County. In Clark County, those 2 April planting dates yielded the same, so no additional benefit or risk that year for planting in April. So this study was funded by Ohio Soybean Council, and this is my student Seth in the field looking at his rye cover crop. I have more slides, but I was just going to pause if there was any questions. I don't see anything in the box. If you guys have any, feel free to type away in the box. So I wanted to just talk a little bit more about some of our cover crop research we've done. My point number 2 of my takeaway was the effect of cover crops is variable. I think there's a really big environment interaction here. When it rains, how big that cover crop is, what's the soil temperature, what's the soil moisture. So there's a lot of variability here. So I wanted to touch on some of our other cover crop projects we've done with soybean. So this is a 2-year study that's now complete. It was in 2018 and 2019, again at the Western Agricultural Research Station in Clark County. And then instead of Worcester, we did this one in Northwest Ohio at the Northwest Agricultural Research Station in Wood County. Here we looked at cover crop planting date. And so we had a 50-50 mix of cereal, rye, and oat, so 25 pounds of each. And then we had different planting dates. We targeted 4 planting dates. It didn't always happen that we had 4, but we looked at September through October for our cover crop planting date. And then we looked at 4 cover crop termination timings. So we terminated early, so that was about 4 weeks prior to planting soybean, and then terminated late, which was 2 weeks prior to planting. So that cover crop was dying as we were planting. And again, the cover crops were terminated with herbicide. So this is looking at just cover crop with the biomass, the biomass of the cover crop. So having a large amount of biomass can have secondary effects that are positive, like weed suppression or help build soil health properties. So this is Wood County in 2019. The second graph is Wood County in 2019. When we took the biomass, they were planted, the cover crops were planted the fall before. But what you'll see in the first year, the first 2 planting dates in September had the highest amount of biomass, and then a decrease later. Second year, technically biomass was all statistically the same, although it looks like there's some differences. There's a lot of plot to plot variability in biomass. So statistically, they were technically the same amount of biomass there. Clark County, this is in 2019. We only had 2 planting dates for our cover crop in 2019 because it was hard to plant fall of 2018. Biomass was the same for those 2 October planting dates. And then the year before in Clark County in 2018, we had a planting date and termination timing interaction. So I'm showing both here. But basically what we see here, our early terminated is in blue, and our late terminated is in, I guess that's a gray color. But overall, there is a reduction in cover crop biomass as we plant that cover crop later until you have that very last planting date, and cover crop biomass was the same. There's also a termination timing effect. So basically, when we terminate later, we let that cover crop grow later. There's a lot of additional biomass that accumulates. So our later termination timings tend to have more biomass. But in general, just in terms of planting dates in Northwest Ohio, planting that cover crop by the end of September is probably ideal. And then in Clark County, more West Central Ohio, the latest you would want to plant is probably early October. Although if the weather cooperates, you may be able to get away with a later planting date. So this is looking at spring biomass by termination timing. Basically, the three locations without the interaction are shown here: Wood County and Clark County. When we terminate later, we have more biomass, and that's pretty consistent. So I see a question in the chat box I'll read real quick. Were the cover crops established into no-till corn stalks, or was there any tillage aid to establishment? And so that's a really good question that I didn't address. But this was actually soybean after soybean in these fields at all the locations and years. So we were trying to see if the cover crop helped provide any rotational benefit. We know soybean after soybean is not ideal because you don't want to have two crops back to back, but sometimes economic pressures favors continuous soybean production. I'll tell Osler to plug his ears, but sometimes continuous soybean is what people are doing. And so we had soybean as a previous crop, and it was no-till. So there was no tillage and no corn stalks either. And if there's any other questions or any follow-up questions, feel free to type away in the chat box. So really, to maximize cover crop biomass production, planting earlier helps, and then terminating late helps as well. And for dates, calendar dates for reference, those late terminated cover crops were May 7th and May 13th. It was later in Wood County in 2019, but if you guys remember 2019, it was probably a miracle we really terminated anything or planted anything. So that was later termination timing. So really, where the rubber hits the road again is how does this impact soybean yield? And so these are all of our locations. There was no interaction of cover crop planting date and termination timing. So I'm going to show those two effects separately. So these are all 4 locations. These are our soybean yields. And I didn't add letters here because it would have been a bunch of A's. But basically, there was no difference in soybean yield depending on our cover crop planting date. So even though we saw a little bit more biomass when we planted earlier, that didn't seem to impact soybean yield good or bad at all. So there was no effect. Termination timing. So termination timing did influence soybean yield at some of the locations. So Wood County, these are the first 2 sets of bars, Wood County in 2018 and then 2019. In 2018, we tended to see higher soybean yield when we terminated that cover crop late or had no cover crop at all. There was a yield reduction with early terminated cover crop. And then in 2019, the following year, our highest yield, even though these bars don't look too different, there was a slight yield increase when we terminated late, or increase, yield was highest when we terminated late. So looking at just highest yields are in A's, just looking at these 2 years, highest yield tend to be when we had that late termination. I think Northwest Ohio is pretty clay soils. It can hold a lot of moisture. I think if you terminate your cover crop too early, there could be some issues with holding soil moisture, keeping temperatures cooler that may negatively impact soybean. But really similar to the study I talked about earlier, in Clark County, cover crop did not matter again. Whether we had a cover crop, had no cover crop, terminated early, terminated late, yields were technically, statistically, all the same. And I guess the other thing to keep in mind too with this cover crop work, it's just cover crop followed by soybean. It's a 1 year. We're looking at not one calendar, but one cropping cycle. So we're not being able to pick up any multi-year or long-term effects of cover crops. This is just really what happens to soybean immediately after having a cover crop for 1 year. So really just in summary of this, the later cover crop planting timings, planting dates, and the later termination timing tend to give you more cover crop biomass. In terms of planting date though, that did not influence soybean yield at all the next year. Termination timing had some effect, none at Clark County, but there was an effect at Wood County. It was not consistent, but the late termination of that cover crop out yielded early in both years, so that more planting green was beneficial in Wood County. So this study was also funded by Ohio Soybean Council. This is my former graduate student. She took a ton of measurements on the study that I didn't mention. She looked at slugs, disease, insects, all kinds of things. These are her slug traps where she would go out. Looks like it's probably even snowing there. It's pretty cold. And look at slugs. We didn't find any, but we did do that as well. So are there any questions or comments from you guys?